Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of CPPR's Dialogue. And today, the discussion is on building coastal reliance, innovative approaches to disaster management in India. I'm Alina Tisabo, Research Associate in the International Relations vertical of CPPR and the moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is the third one in our webinar series as part of a research project titled Indian Coastal Think Tank Network, supported by the Asia Foundation, New Delhi. The Indian Coastal Think Tank Network, or ICTN as we call it, aims to create a network of coastal think tanks focused on policy-driven analysis of issues in India's coastal region from local, regional, and national perspectives. We have 9 different experts joining us on this network from different think tanks and institutions across coastal states in India, focusing on the following themes: climate change and gender, coastal security, blue economy, fisheries, coastal ecology, tourism, maritime domain awareness, ports and shipping, disaster management, coastal energy, and coastal heritage. For today's webinar, our thematic area for discussion is disaster management. Essentially, we'll try to understand how disasters are managed in the coastal regions and how different it is from other regions. India's coastal regions are vital to the nation's development, hosting a significant portion of the population and serving as hubs for economic, cultural, and ecological activity. Nearly 17% of India's population resides in these regions, highlighting their importance. However, these regions are highly susceptible to natural disasters such as storms, tsunamis, coastal erosion, and flooding. Climate change has intensified these risks, increasing both the frequency and severity of such events. Therefore, designing and implementing effective disaster management strategies is essential to safeguard livelihoods and preserve the delicate coastal ecosystems. This requires a thorough analysis of existing national, state, and district disaster management plans and strategies. The geography and socio-economic dynamics of India's coastal region present unique challenges. High population density, unregulated urbanization, inadequate infrastructure, and the absence of a robust early warning system exacerbate vulnerability. Addressing these issues require the integration of early warning systems, community resilience building, improved infrastructure, and innovative scientific technologies to develop and implement effective policies. Disaster management in coastal regions demand a holistic approach that combines scientific innovation, sound public policy, and active community participation. Sustainable practices and investment in long-term resilience are crucial for protecting coastal ecosystems and communities. A collaborative effort involving civil society, governments, and local communities is essential to tackle the challenges posed by natural disasters effectively and ensure a sustainable future for India's coastal region. And before we get to the conversation today, I would like to introduce you to our esteemed panelists for the day. Mr. Meher Bhatt. Mr. Meher R. Bhatt is the director of All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. He works on reducing risk-related action and learning, experience learning series on learning and risk mitigation, South Asia Disasters.net, Apnavat Nivaran, and Vipada Nivaran are various other initiatives that he does. He was also a senior fellow of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and was a member of the panel that selects the humanitarian coordinators for the United Nations. He advises climate development knowledge networks work on climate compatibility development in 9 states of India, with focus on urban resilience, green finance, renewable energy at a subnational level. I welcome you, sir, to this webinar.
Thank you.
And to join on the conversation, we have with us Mr. Dunu Roy. Mr. Dunu Roy is a director of Hazard Center, New Delhi, and has worked for over 4 decades in both rural and urban scenarios in land and water management, secure settlement, safe work, environmental planning, leadership training, and pollution control. Dunu Roy served as the Dean of Research at the People Science Institute, Dehradun. He's also a consultant to various agencies in private and public sector on resource management, environment, biodiversity, and disaster preparedness in several states of India. Welcome, sir, to the webinar. We're also joined by Dr. N. Venugopalan. Dr. N. Venugopalan is the program manager at the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, where he has been working for the past 20 years. Thank you, sir, for joining us on this conversation today. Welcome, sir, to the webinar. And I'm sure we'll all have an engaging discussion ahead. And I would like to remind our viewers that you can put your questions in the YouTube comment box, which we'll be taking up towards the end of the session. Now, to essentially begin with the session, I would like to start by asking the first question to Meher Bhatt. Disaster management is an important vulnerability in the coastal region, and appropriate policies and strategies are necessary to ensure the safety of the people. Keeping this background in mind, what are the disaster management policies currently in place, especially focusing on coastal region? What do these policies lack, and are the strong institutional mechanisms in place?
Thank you. Thank you for this question, and my thanks to the center as well as to the panel members here, and my respect. It's a great honor to be here. And I thought I would start to reply this, mainly to draw from AIDMI's or India Disaster Mitigation Institute's experience on coastal India. The policy structure is rather unusual from our points of view, and ours is a bottom-up point of view, is that there are things, policies are there, but they are also not there. And partly because policies are there, but not focused enough on coastal areas and coastal communities, or are there, but not necessarily performing in favor of the coastal areas and coastal communities from time to time. So there is a tremendous opportunity to focus them further. And I'm drawing this from our work after the Kandla cyclone, one of the oldest piece of our work in 1989, and subsequently on Orissa supercyclone, but also something subsequently in terms of tsunami recovery all over the Indian coast that we had worked on. What we found, one of the areas was displacement due to cyclones, but other coastal disasters, and the coastal sea level related risk that is facing. That is something where a lot of policy work is needed to focus on. There is also, for example, coastal industries. Fisheries, we will hear a lot and very clearly from Dr. Venu, but salt industry, for example, marine industry, one of the marine industries, and the industrial development policy for coastal regions doesn't necessarily focus on how the industries can address this risk, or the industrial workers can address this risk, or how the industrial development and planning that we are doing can address this risk. And this is something quite clearly in our work with Arvind Kumar and Soumya Haldar from the Central Source Salt and Marine Research Institute came out. So basically, all development policies, almost all development policies, do not focus with the nuance of the coastal disaster risk that they face. It may be early warning, as it was already pointed out. It may be industrial policy, as I have said. It may be maritime policy with focus on disaster. It may be port development. It may be the blue economy related to the work that the government of India and various states are doing so enthusiastically, so rapidly, but focus on possible risk and how that will slow down or disrupt has not been quite there. So that's what we have found in our work. We also find that as far as policies are concerned, the coastal areas need additional attention, especially, for example, we don't have data to show that what is the economic loss to coastal areas and coastal communities due to various disasters, may it be cyclone, may it be flooding, may it be sea level rise, but may it be also, so to speak, new hazards such as extreme heat that is far more severely perceived and experienced in coastal areas. We have also found in our work that the coastal areas of India, all over India, but coastal areas also are facing rising coastal floods. And we saw part of that in Kerala 2018 flood, though it was not a coastal flood per se, but it was a flood in a coastal state. We've seen that in a recent flooding in Tamil Nadu, for example. So on and so forth. The focus on extreme events such as floods in coastal areas needs more policy support in terms of coastal urban planning, coastal disaster planning. And I'll give two more examples of that. We have also found in our work with CISRO ocean and atmosphere related work that Alistair Hobday is doing, and that is marine heat wave and cyclone. And that is something which is relatively new area, not in terms of hazard, but in terms of being recognized scientifically and put on the IPCC focus as well, and to nationalize it, to sub-nationalize it, and mostly localize that what is happening at local level, community level. So that kind of work, and then put it into the local policies as well. That is something still needs to be done. I'll give you some examples on where this is being done. And for example, tropical cyclone research work that is being done in the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. And there we have found that new areas for coastal risk policies are coming up. For example, plastic pollution. So how do you make coastal areas plastic free? The Bombay coast, for example, the fisheries there is so much harm because of the plastic that is there in the sea. So how do you make plastic pollution free and sustainable marine and coastal ecosystem? So policies for that, and drawing those policies from experience and on the ground activities is very much that is needed. Indonesia is doing that, we are aware of, and Philippines is doing that very well. And we need to do that in India as well. So these are some of the policy areas that I would like to point out where work is done, more work needs to be done, both in terms of policy making, policy shaping, policy performance, because we have policies which don't necessarily perform all the time. And that is something which is needed to give an enabling environment for coastal areas and communities to grow faster, better, and safer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for drawing upon all these examples to show where there has been a lack in terms of disaster management in the coastal regions in India. Now we'll move on a bit to the digital technology side of things, or more in terms of the resources. So the next question is to Mr. Dunu Roy about what are the various technologies or resources and advancements in coastal disaster management. Are these being put into good use? And if not, why do you think these aids do not reach people in need of time?
Thank you for inviting me for this discussion. I think Professor Meher Bhatt has clearly outlined what are the various problems that are creeping up. I would start with one disagreement. And that disagreement is that these are not natural disasters, as you have referred to, Alina. They are now all human-made disasters and largely expert-made. So experts have created all these modern disasters, and we need to recognize that very carefully. The second thing I would point out is something we were taught in engineering long ago, that before attempting to find a solution to a problem, you must first understand the problem. Without understanding the problem, just merely asking for a solution on the basis of one's perceptions is a very wrong approach. It indicates that you have not understood the problem. The coast, in particular, must be seen as the interface between land and ocean. And therefore, it's a very dynamic system. Why? Because the land affects it on one side and the ocean impacts upon it from the other side. And coasts are essentially land building and destroying areas. That means soil that comes from the land itself builds the coast and the ocean takes it away. The same thing happens with water. The same thing happens with flora and fauna. So therefore, it's a transitional zone. Now, if it were a natural disaster, as you have termed it, Alina, then there would be natural systems at work. And the earlier natural systems in the coasts were three. One were what are called lagoons. These are things that I think Kerala is very familiar with. These are the backwaters. That is, water has a way of being stored as a buffer between the land and the ocean. The second is the mangroves, which protect the edge of the land because they grow in salt water. They don't grow in fresh water. And the third are the dunes. The dunes attempt to keep the ocean at bay, but they also allow water to drain out into the ocean. So it's a two-way gate, the natural dune. Human beings have destroyed all these three. And instead of dunes, we have started building artificial bunds or embankments, as we call them. And in our wisdom, we have made the embankments one-way systems. That is, the embankment only protects from the ocean. It does not protect you from the rainfall or the typhoon or the cyclone that carries water over the embankment and dumps it in. It merely acts as a barrier to that too. So you can't have an artificial embankment replacing the natural dune. The same thing has happened with lagoons. I remember in the Chilika Lake, because of the choking of the lake, the outlet got choked. And the World Bank, in its wisdom, decided to construct a new outlet into the ocean to keep the lake safe. But in keeping the lake safe, they have destroyed the rest of the ecosystem. So these are areas which we need to look at of how to replace these are natural systems with artificial systems and still not destroy the ecosystem. Now, coming to the warning systems or coming to the preventive measures that can be taken, as long as there were natural systems in place, there were also natural knowledge systems. Fishermen, for example, and particularly fisherwomen who observed the birds, could tell by bird behavior whether heavy rainfall or a typhoon was expected. Why? Because you see, these send out currents, both in the air and in the water, long before the event, long before a tsunami. For example, the currents travel much faster. And creatures living in the air and in the sea sense these. Earlier, it used to be considered mythology. Now, with advances in research, we found that it is true. And because they sense it, their behavior changes. People were used to, in a sense, interpreting these behavioral changes and saying today is not a good day for going out fishing. Or there's something happening upstream in the rivers which might create a flood. So be careful. But ever since artificial systems like dams up in the highlands have come up, these knowledge systems have gone into disuse. They have to, because they're no longer dependent on a traditional living wisdom. And what has happened is that laboratories and research institutions have taken over. They collect data over a long time. I'm not decrying their purpose. They collect data over a long time. They begin to predict patterns, and then they offer warnings. But these warnings are not part of knowledge systems at the popular level yet. They are in terms of experts interpreting data, creating warnings, and then warning people. This is the wrong approach, according to me. people are perfectly capable, in my mind, and we have many experiments to show this, to interpret data for themselves, provided they have access to the data. They don't. So they have access to now Wi-Fi. They have access to the smartphone, but the government in its wisdom or the research institutions in their wisdom will not put the data onto the net. It's all secret. Water data, river data, soil data, it's all secret because of international disagreements. So to date, for instance, we do not know what are flow discharges in rivers anywhere, because if the river crosses a national boundary or a state boundary, there's going to be a dispute. If they know how much water is actually flowing or how much silt is coming with that water. But if people had access to these, if they had access to knowledge of biodiversity in waters, they would be able to tell that something is happening upstream. I mean, take the case of floods in Kerala. They all happened because of capture of water upstream. When the water was suddenly released, then floods took place in the coastal areas. This sudden release means that the quality of the water has changed. And the first indicator of the quality of the water is biodiversity. People don't have access to the data. People can't even measure it. If I go out to a river and start measuring it, the next moment the police will be there asking, who are you and why are you measuring? So unless democratization of knowledge, including the vast amounts of digital data that we are producing, takes place, it will remain in the hands of experts, and experts will keep saying, people don't listen to us. The question is, why should people listen to them when they don't know what it is that they're listening to? So people must be drawn into the generation, interpretation, and use of digital data itself. And this, I think, has been amply demonstrated by the use of the phone and the cell phone in recent times by huge numbers of people across India and the globe. And I would conclude there, and we'll take up questions on that later on.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting various important elements in terms of disaster management. And one of the things that you've spoken about was essentially regarding fish workers. So my next question is to Dr. N. Venugopalan, who has had experience working with fish workers. So the first question to Dr. Venugopal is, how do disasters and their management affect the life, livelihood, and living condition of fish workers? Can you draw a gendered perspective on the same as well?
Yeah, so what I'm going to speak today is more from our experiences in working with fish workers, which include women as well as men. And especially in the aftermath of tsunami 2004 and 2017 cyclone Oki, and continuous cyclones, continuous natural disasters on the eastern seaboard of India. And if you look at these experiences actually show us the level of early warning systems we have, the level of adaptation techniques we have, the level of social protection measures we have, the level of our preparedness to build back better we have, and especially the number of people we lost and number of productive assets we lost. And these disasters always create an exacerbate existing conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity of fisher people in terms of human losses, material losses, economic and environmental losses, and impact in India. And of course, the loss of lives is the most dramatic impact. affecting not only surviving household members, but also potentially upsetting economic and social activities and systems which exist outside the immediate context. If you look at past 20 years or 25 years of natural disasters which impacted coastal fishing communities in India, we can see some kind of a pattern of things emerging. Let us look at that pattern before we get into more technological advancements and separately talk about disaster management act in India. One is the loss of fishing artifacts, more easily lost than the land-based property. Second is the loss of fishing opportunities and income of the household. Thirdly, the loss of social infrastructure, which includes schools, health centers, community centers, cyclones.
So
Yes,
loss of
please.
natural habitats, and loss of access to aquatic living resources, loss of markets and disruption in the supply chain systems, which includes the women fish workers who are working in the post-harvest sector, and loss of fisheries infrastructure, and loss of housing. And this is also exacerbating poverty for a longer duration of time. And food security and incidents and malnutrition in the coastal fishing communities. And greater risks from increasing frequency of shocks and disasters lead to reduced resilience of fishing communities. And these are the major 5 or 10 factors I can perceive how the disasters and their management impacts on the livelihood and living conditions of fish workers in coastal areas in India.
Thank you, sir, for drawing out an important perspective in terms of how disaster management affects the fish workers. So the next question would majorly focus on one of the important things that you brought up on, that is essentially community reliance and how people's reliance and sort of reduces in terms of these kind of things. So my next question is to Mr. Meherbhat. So one of the missions at your institute, that is Institute of all India Disaster Mitigation Institute, does is link the voice of at-risk communities to those of the decision makers of humanitarian initiatives for effective long recovery. So how do you create this link, and what are the processes to sustain it? And also bring in a little bit of community engagement. To what extent can community engagement provide creative solutions and management opportunities during a disaster?
Thank you. No, I'd like to very much like to address this. We have slightly different take, if we can take, in a sense that it's not so much how do you give coastal community a voice, but maybe more than that. How do you give them a voice? How do you give them validation? How do you give them visibility? But in fact, how do we make them better and more effective citizens of our country who in fact contribute to the national economy and development, to nation building, and also deserves all that every citizen needs, such as you and me. So that's the perspective that All India Disaster Mitigation Institute comes from, that anybody who is affected by disaster, men, women, children, excluded groups, as well as who are likely to be affected, they are very much part of the nation building process that we are part of, including the coastal communities. So that's the approach that we have been taking. There are 4 or 5 ways we have found are good ways to do that. And one of the ways is to be part of the policy engagement. One way we know within policy engagement is to activism, where you protest against the policies which are wrong or not working. And that's something area there is a lot of civil society activity and is needed, and it's being done. So we leave that, not always, but mostly. In some areas where there isn't enough, and because of our skills and our experience and expertise, we contribute there. And that's the policy shaping or policy making, being a planning and action planning organization. How people can contribute, in our case, coastal people can contribute to making coastal disaster management plans for coastal states, for example, for coastal communities, for example, that is village level, for coastal urban areas, that is the coastal city disaster management plans, for coastal districts, that is coastal district disaster management plans, which their specific focus on coastal areas. Even schools, coastal schools need disaster management plan under the existing educational setup that we have. Each school must have a disaster management plan, and coastal schools must have coastal disaster management plans. And are they there? And if they are not there, how can that be done by the local communities, including students and teachers? So that's one area. The second area, which is very important, and that is building capacity. And mostly it's assumed that the capacity needs to be built of the communities, and rightly so in many areas. But we also find that the capacity needs to be built for those such as us, our capacity to work with local communities who are affected by coastal disasters. So building capacity on both sides so that we can both become more capable to make coastal areas safer and make coastal areas economic engines of India's development, social engines of India's unity and strength. So that's another area, capacity. And also there is an assumption that there is a need to build capacity. Very often we found that there exists capacity. There are people capable of doing things. They don't have opportunity, they don't have position, they don't have resources. And how do you help? How do you support? How do you facilitate to make that happen? So that's a capacity building part. The third part is the way we do is a lot of pilot and demonstration. But how do you actually show that something is working on the ground? For example, that how the coastal heat is different than heat in the other cities. And some of our work in some of the coastal areas, both in Orissa and Kerala, we are able to show that extreme heat in coastal areas are a different phenomenon, not entirely, but it needs different attention. And how do you do that? So you actually do projects on the ground to demonstrate, to pilot, and then there's no intention to make it nationwide. That's the job of the state authorities, government authorities. They will do it, and people will ask them to do it. But actually, when it works, the confidence of people in general and authorities in particular are more confident to move ahead, and money is being put into that. So that's a third area. The fourth area in coastal community related risk reduction is very much reviews and evaluations. For example, tsunami, and there wasn't a joint tsunami evaluation of not only all the coastal areas of India, not for all coastal areas of India, and we agreed to work with the Disaster Emergency Committee of the UK, who had spent really millions of pounds for coastal recovery. And what is it that we have learned from coastal recovery of tsunami to any future recovery? And some of the recommendations, there was a long list, but we are very happy to see that after these many years, this is an anniversary, we were able to track that quite a few of recommendations have actually taken in place and are part of the national and in our often also global humanitarian system as well. So that's the fourth area, reviews, evaluations, and observations. Very often we observe the same problem with same points of view. And how do you see it from different point of view, from the point of view of community, the affected population, and you immediately find something more that can be done, something differently can be done. And the last is a lot of, as Dunnu Saab and Venu Saab said, a lot of knowledge, with real experience and knowledge exist at the grassroots level, at a community level, at affected population level. And we don't use it and ignore it. We don't let them use it across the states, across the cities, across the borders. And we don't really give enough support, financial, knowledge-wise, tools-wise, technology-wise, opportunity-wise, to use the things that they already know. So that is something of sort of co-creating, co-supporting, co-using jointly knowledge. That's a fifth area. So these are the 5 areas that we found work. And in terms of subject matter, we found that the managed retreat in coastal areas in South Asia. I'm not advocate of retreat from the sea level rise in all the areas all the time, but there are specific locations, specific circumstances, specific occupation where it is needed and possible, and let people decide themselves. But that's an area where these 5 ways of working are very useful. Then very often either we work with communities or we report what they are thinking, but thinking and working with the communities. And that's something very much is needed. And there has to be a lot of local focus of resources and actions at a local level. And that's something that we are very much working on. Very interesting work in Toronto by Nasrat Jahan, a PhD student, is doing that. And we think that that's something very useful to work. We also find, and I'll end very quickly, is the research agenda on coastal disaster studies. And there isn't something like that worked out. And recently we worked all across South Asia to see what are the research and innovation agenda that is needed for coastal areas to do that. So that's another area. There is very good work Dr. Amita Singh has done there as well. And that's something we all could benefit from. Then HOISA, for example, a humanitarian observatory initiative has looked at observing resilience in coastal South Asia, including India, and how the resilience is seen very much from scientific, technocratic, top-down structured way. And I'm not saying that is not needed at all. It is needed, but that's not enough. So what are the other ways of looking at, for example, bottom-up, soft technology, alternative technology point of view, from the point of view of not only structures, but movements and processes. So that's something that's very much there. And I'd like to end with of area that we are struggling, we haven't done, but we are struggling to address, and people would be interested to do it themselves, do it with us, is the critical connection between oceans and the coast areas, specifically ocean health and coastal climate sustainability. So what is the interface? And we have found so far, I would like to share, and Dr. Venu and Dr. Lulu Roy may have some reaction to that, is that coastal areas are seen as something which is buffered, sandwiched in between. But what we find that that's true, but also equally true is that coastal areas open up both land and the sea for our human, not economic intervention, but human well-being, human enterprise. So it's not the boundaries. Coastal areas are very often, due to the perhaps colonial period, treated as boundaries, but they are also actually the bridges to bring all that is the ocean area has to offer, all that the land area has to offer. How do you see this ocean, land, and coastal area connect? Far more integrated manner, far more holistic manner. And that's something we see a lot of demand coming from local communities. Fisheries, of course, in Dr. Venu, we say that, but also salt farmers, for example, in the coastal areas, coastal transportation workers, coastal construction workers, coastal forest workers, coastal settlement builders. So we see this whole new possibility of building India's coastal area, not as something as a two silo sector, but integrated approach to build coastal areas. And I'd like to end there. I have some more examples, but during question answers will come up. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. It was really interesting to listen to, first-hand knowledge of like working in the institute, since the works of All India Disaster Mitigation Institute is very much, prominent with this webinar, and how you've highlighted the various examples as well as the various works in terms of the activism or in terms of the heat as well was very interesting in particular. My next question is to Mr. Dunu Roy. How does coastal disaster management differ in urban and rural settings? What are some insights that could help understand the extent of resilience from both these coastal communities?
I would start with two comments. Can you hear me? Is my voice audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. I would start with two comments. One is Professor Venugopal's description of the losses to coastal communities. Actually, if you just open up the box a bit, every one of those losses is part of a development process. Whether it's loss of shelter, loss of livelihoods, loss of property, somewhere or the other, or a port is coming up, an industrial plant is coming up, a dam is being built, a flood is taking place. So there's some developmental activity that is affecting the coast. That's one. The second is Professor Meher's comment that the coast is an interface. I fully agree. It's an interface. But the question is it just a utilitarian interface? Is it just an interface for us to be able to use the land and the ocean? Or do we owe a responsibility to both land and ocean to function with them as part of being land and ocean? So there is an external element there. And I will just illustrate this by using three examples. One is the coast itself. What is happening on the coast? And I would like, through these examples, to highlight Mayor's main point, according to me, which is of co-creating knowledge in common with communities. Now, when the first cyclones started hitting the Orissa coast way back in the 70s, we operated right along that eastern coast. And we found that first thing to get destroyed was housing. And every NGO, every government agency went back to rebuild houses. And the technology which was sensed was needed was houses that was last. So the idea was to build brick and concrete houses and schools and shelters. Communities protested. They said, we do not want brick and concrete. We would like to build with bamboo because it's locally available, thatch because it's locally available, and these are materials we know we can use. We just need to build it into policy. So as a group, our responsibility was to co-create a knowledge system that would build into housing policy itself. That housing policy must focus on locally available resources, locally available skills, and houses that can be built and rebuilt. If they get destroyed, then people will rebuild it at much lower cost. That's one. Second example I will give is not only of urban communities, but of communities that are inland, whose activities affect the coast. So for example, those communities above the Delta region, where the coast is, in those communities amongst the highlands, they protested against the construction of dams during the period of the emergence of the Damodar Valley Corporation, which was patterned on the Tennessee Valley Corporation of the US. They were built for producing energy, and to build those dams, there were about 14 dams, major and minor, which were built up in the Jharkhand valleys in order to produce that energy. And in addition, because there were multiple projects, they were also designed to provide irrigation. communities protested because they said the moment you build these structures, they will deprive communities downstream of fertile soil and water around the year. Now they will be controlled by these structures upstream. Nobody listened to them in Jharkhand, but they listened to them in Bihar. And so the Bihar water irrigation system is significantly different from the Jharkhand irrigation system. The third example I will give you of in the ocean itself, that the waste from all land goes into the ocean. And both along the Bombay coast as well as along the Tamil Nadu coast, there have been extensive community protests against discharge of plastics, heavy metals, and minerals into the ocean. Why? Because they destroy livelihoods on land. They come right back to you. And in fact, just for the audience's interest, when the first birth control pills were introduced in Europe, they affected the urine, which got discharged into the drains, which went into the North Atlantic, and they destroyed the fishery population because the fish came back with those proteins in their bodies, and they disturbed the cycle in human beings. So there is an ecological cycle that is at work. Communities know a lot more about these ecological cycles. If only we would listen to communities, we would probably design much better policy.
Thank you, sir, for drawing upon these examples. It was really insightful to know about specific issues and the need for local knowledge as well as communities' knowledge about certain issues to be highlighted for disaster management. Now, my next question is to Dr. Venu. To what extent does climate change contribute to coastal disasters in recent years? And do we have sufficient structures for disaster risk adoption at national, regional, and local levels of governance in these cases?
Well, this is very interesting. The way question is posed is very interesting way, asking that to what extent does climate change contribute to coastal disasters in recent years? So let me take one example from the National Institute of Disaster Management Authority. It's a quote from their book on mapping climatic and biological disasters in India, which says that during the period from 1995 to 2020, 4 years before, a total of 104,000 deaths were reported for selected 4 climate-related disaster events. One is floods, one is cyclones, one is cold waves, and one is heat waves. And if you look at in these 100,000 deaths, cyclone alone accounted for 48% of India's overall human life lost due to climate-related disasters, followed by 26% due to heat waves, followed by 18% due to floods, followed by 8% due to cold waves. This analysis actually highlights that India experienced huge mortality due to climate-related events in last 20-25 years or more. Now, if you look at climate change is like a box. We are talking about a number of factors, which are some are only available at the level of a scientific analysis. Some are available at the level of day-to-day life of fishermen on the coast, which includes very unclear sea level rise, an increase in sea surface temperature, which fishermen are experiencing all the time, salinity level, which also impacts on the fisheries resources, especially the movement of sardines, and change in wind patterns, which obstructs the fisher's voyage, which also made the cyclone Oki and loss of 300 people, more than 300 people. And change in seasonality of fish resources, variance in rainfall, and associated with number of species disappearing from the seasonal months in Kerala and other places, and changes in waves and currents, which is very much a factor in West Bengal, and natural disasters, including changes in the severity of cyclones in Orissa and other places, tidal action in coastal areas, and very bad mud flows and turbidity and shoreline changes, storm surges, coastal flooding, salinization of coastal aquifers, which is impacting the life and livelihood of fisherfolk in a major way, or the fisherfolk who are forced to go for certain kind of occupational pluralism due to number of fishing days lost and due to these impacts. The existing vulnerabilities, if you look at, which have less control, is multiplied by also the increase in fleet size, increase in the length of the boat, increase in the capacity of the horsepower, increase in the number of fishing trips we undertake, as well as using of destructive fishing techniques. All this actually compounding the fact of a climate disaster into more. Along with, if you look at, as Dunu Roy said, the pollution, competition for coastal space and resources. This is one of the major factors which makes any adaptation mitigation techniques of climate change less impactful, because the coast is a congested space now. Coast is a space for tourism. Coast is a space for infrastructure development. This is impacting the life and livelihoods of dependent communities like fisher-dependent communities like fishers, as well as the coastal communities who are living on the coast but working in inland area in a major way. So competition for coastal space and resources, if you ask me, is one of the major factors which makes any disaster prevention, adaptation, mitigation very futile. And increase in coastal area population. We never encountered this issue. If you look at 40 million people living in Canada's coastline, and if you look at Kerala coastline, which is 450 people per square kilometer, the density of population living on the coast, dependent on the coast, is increasing day by day. They have no place to move. So we need to have not only coastal regulations or notifications, we need to have coastal construction manuals. We need to have setback lines. Even if there's a disaster or a coastal flooding, inundation, tidal surges, whatever, we need to have a setback line where the coastal fishing community who can reside, who can go back. So unless we develop certain very simple soft measures like setback lines and coastal construction manuals, and coast is not open for all kinds of infrastructure development, I think that we will make the mitigation and adaptation aspects of climate change more difficult in the future. And then if you look at, we need to develop and integrate better social protection measures and facilities like parametric insurance for the number of number of days lost due to bad weather. And we have to integrate these policies into climate change and fisheries policies. We have to integrate this together and the benefits of fishers employed, especially in the informal sectors. And I also had said earlier that there are many factors which contribute to climate change box, but due to our shortage of time, we cannot look at quite a few factors. Indian coast is a geomorphologically very dynamic space, and with shoreline changes, coastal erosions, coastal accretions, and number of factors, and natural tendency to leave the coast. So we need to take into consideration whatever we are going to do on the coast is impacting, is taking care of these factors before we get into anything. And also we need to develop a setback line to protect the lives of fishing communities. The existing disaster management and disaster risk management measures, as outlined in the National Institute of Disaster Management Authority, face various challenges. If you look at it, one is inadequate resources, one is poor infrastructure, one is limited awareness and education among the stakeholders, weak institutional capacity for authorities to implement, inadequate coordination and communication, and lack of cross-sectoral collaboration, and inadequate research and innovation. We need to have certain kind of technological degree available for understanding the coast. We need to have a Cartosat 3 version, which gives you 1:10 centimeter, 1:10 centimeter result out. Like we should be able to see a phone size image from the coast. Then only we can decide what are the new structures that are coming up on the coast. How does it impact the communities? How does it accentuate the disaster aspects? Lastly, what I would like to say that regarding the question about sufficient structures to deal with disaster risk reduction in coastal areas, we would require improved and innovative measures at the institutional level, like access to maps, training of officers, better social safety nets like parametric insurance, subsidies to reduce or recover from the negative impacts of climate change. At the level of mechanisms, we have to assess the effectiveness of formal and informal mechanisms in place to support the participation of coastal fishing communities in designing, planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating climate change adaptation measures. At a process level, we have to ask the question, who are the actors involved in these processes? And what are the existing processes like public consultations, one-to-one dialogue, training programs, which can provide periodic feedback about the need for adaptation in the context of fisheries at various levels. Because one thing which makes climate change very different from any other natural disasters is the dynamic character of that. So we need to have a dynamic policy which is able to change, able to cope with the changes, which can change over a period of time, integrating new elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So we actually reached to the end of the question, but we have a couple of questions that came through our YouTube chat. So I have put them in the chat box. I'll read it out. The first question is how to utilize the marine waste rather than leaving it in the ocean, spoiling the coastal ecosystem. Another question is it possible to create an archival project that mobilizes and studies coastal knowledge systems and take it into the policy level? We also have another question that is, if these efforts have already been taken, what are the challenges at the time that hindered such a process? So if all of you could quickly run us through this, then it would be really great since we are a little bit short of time.
I have a very quick response to all three questions. And that is, you see, Venu just described that the coast has become a site for competition. Now, as long as it is going to be a site for competition, the knowledge system that created this competitive spirit cannot find a solution. It will continue to compete. It will continue to create the problem. You need a different knowledge system. Same thing with waste. You cannot first produce waste out of a development process and then say, how can the same development process manage the waste? We should not have created the waste in the first place. That is real development. This endless process of solving a problem to create a new problem is what we understand today as development. And this needs to be challenged. And it can only be challenged by adopting a completely different system itself. So we need to think about that.
I have only one point to say. If you look at the climate change scenario, at the level of preparation and adaptation, the communities and the coastal knowledge systems and the fishers' knowledges are very helpful. But at the level of mitigation, you need to have a more innovative and competent research institutions to come in. So if we can have a dialogue which is based on a kind of a accepting each other between the scientific community and the coastal community, we will go for a longer, we will make a good strides.
Yeah, thank you. 3 questions. One is on pollution, second is on archival, and third is what are the hindrances? And very quick responses, and please be in touch should there be need for more explanation because of brevity. On pollution, there is, I think, one line response to that is that we need to find reversal processes. You know, this circular economy that we are talking about. But how does it work other way around? That is how what the waste is created can become a natural resource, not by keep on moving into a circular economy, but by actually reversal of that. And that's something a lot of different thinking is needed. There's some experience there. And it's a kind of conceptual work as well as on the ground work, but that's something very much is needed. And I'm really glad that pollution has been raised as one of the disasters or major challenge to the coastal areas and communities. On archivals, in our own way and in a small way, we have a collection of coastal disaster management related material, and which is expanding. And anybody who wants to join in to add something to that, or be partner to that, I think it's a very good idea, and it must be done sooner than later. And on the hindrances, 4 quick areas. One is the awareness about what is being done. For example, very good work that Dr. Venu mentioned, and there is far more to that, but what he has mentioned, people in Thailand, in Manila, for example, Philippines, in terms of parts of Sundarbans, there are still people who need to know about how this work is being done and how fisher folks are being organized and how they are being made part of the economic development. So I think that part of awareness is very important. Second is investment. We invested but higher level in structures, but not at local level, not where the actual action is taking place. And that would be very useful to do that. Fourth is in terms of governance, and how do we have decentralized, distributed network governance where there is people that we are talking about have not only have a voice, as I said, or are visible, but are actually taking decisions about their future, coastal future, or coastal futures, many futures. So that's the third. And fourth and the last thing I would suggest in terms of hindrance is the anticipation. What we've listed here so far, except a couple of things, pollution being one of those 2 things, is we have anticipated only something which is in the near side as far as disaster risk is concerned. But what kind of risk we are about to face in next 10 years, 15 years, 30 years, and that is something at local level, national level, we are not looking at, as far as I know, or we are not looking at adequately. So let's do that as well. So these are the 4 things I think are hindering upscaling, wide scaling, making the much larger impact than we have been able to do so far. Thank you.
Thank you all for answering the questions. Now, before we wrap, these are the following takeaways from the webinar. So I'll start with Mr. Meher Bhatt. Thank you so much, sir, for explaining and highlighting the various initiatives that are taken at your institute, right with the sort of issues in terms of the lack of proper or apt policies in the coastal areas that actually meet the needs of the people, and also bringing in examples of how there is a lack of data on the destruction of economic resources in the in the coastal communities. Then also another important point that you've highlighted is with regard to the need for activism, or also about how your institute engages in activism as well as various policy engagements as well. And a very innovative idea was also with regard to the capacity building, about how there needs to be capacity building for the think tanks as well as people who are, focusing on disaster management and are prepared to help people. Not only capacity building that has to be there for the people who face this, but also it needs to be there for people who are training these people as well. And the another important thing that Mr. Meher concluded with was with respect to how important it is for grassroots level knowledge to be used and utilized. Now, moving on to Dunu Roy, Mr. Dunu Roy had highlighted the need to rethink about the root causes of these natural disasters and how it is important to understand that most of these disasters, are not essentially, natural in itself. And the need to rethink and as well as take a step back and understand how nature has its own ways of dealing through these disasters is very important. And the knowledge of fishermen and also their ideas in terms of how various of these disasters can be handled was also an important idea that Dunu Roy had discussed. He's also brought in an example of how there is a lack of access in terms of biodiversity of data, how people must have access to these data in order for better disaster management facilities. And another example that Mr. Dunu Roy had drawn upon is about how there have been issues with respect to the housing policies, and how he drew up an example from something that he has worked upon. He said how, in terms of these housing policies, how there is a lack of knowledge that is taken from the coastal communities as well as the people in the region, which must be highlighted as these are the kind of things that the government must take in mind while they move forward with the disaster management plans. And moving on to Dr. N. Venugopalan, thank you, sir, for highlighting the various problems that the fisher community faces in terms of the gendered perspective as well. Thank you for bringing in points of the lack of fishing opportunities, the lost markets, as well as the fishing infrastructure, while also bringing in an important point of how there is a reduced resilience in people when these disasters struck again and again. Now, concluding it with what Dr. N. Venugopalan said is how there must be a need for the coastal development, how there must be this leverage between what is more important, essentially, whether it must be the coastal tourism, or also at the same time, it must not be at the cost of the people living in the area. Now, these are the various things that were drawn up, and all the disaster management policies are in place. They're not essentially performing well in terms of coastal areas and communities. A more rigid policy framework is required to address this lag and focusing on risk and nuances of the cost. It was also brought to attention how traditional knowledge coastal systems are being eroded, or rather not being attention. It is imperative to pay heed to these systems in understanding the problems faced by coastal communities. And with this, I think we've come to the conclusion of the webinar, and I thank our panelists for taking their valuable time out and sharing their expert viewpoints with us. CPPR extends our gratitude to the Asia Foundation for supporting us in this project in building a network for coastal think tanks in India. I also thank the CPPR team for organizing the webinar. And last but not the least, I thank the audience for participating in our discussion for the day. Thank you all. And also, please keep following on our social media for more updates on our ICTN project. With this, I conclude our webinar, and thank you all, and wishing you all a great day ahead.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank you everyone for joining us.
Nice to meet all of you.